Hi everyone, it's Darek Zabrocki and I'm a concept designer working for films and games. I'm also a CEO and co-founder of Focal Point School. I've been in this field for almost a decade and contributed to quite a few well-known franchises like Call of Duty, Destiny, Maze Runner, Assassin's Creed, and many more. So in this video tutorial, I would like to introduce you to an Octane render. This actually render has been one of the main tools in my tool bag for many years already, and why I will be giving you an introduction to Octane. I'm gonna use specifically the version that features RTX technology that's being developed by NVIDIA. But first, I would like to just show you and introduce you to, what sort of stuff I'm using Octane for, so you get a better understanding on how I'm actually approaching my render and use it in my daily workflow. So I'm mostly doing concept art that's being very painterly. It's probably because I come from 2D background. I used to paint. I used to draw a lot before I even got into concept art industry. So you can see on some of the examples that my concepts are pretty painterly because I still do love that 2D, that painterly touch, even to the raw renders. And for instance, you can compare the raw render here, and of course I got some props that I've been building along the way. I usually build up those props to add them along the process because I call my workflow, my techniques, concept art, which is a hybrid concept art. So the final results, of course, is what matters, and it's basically putting all different techniques into one bag. When I paint over on top of my renders, when I use different tools, different softwares, but for rendering paths, I use Octane, and in this video series, I will be guiding you through using Octane on different levels. I will also add later on a video on post-production, which actually plays a big role in my concept art process. Here is a good example of how I translated my 2D painting into 3D location, because my main expertise is to build worlds, to inspire level designers with my environment concepts. So I like sometimes to take my 2D paintings or 2D concepts and basically build them up in 3D, and then of course take it to Octane to render it out. But on top of that, of course, it comes a 2D path, which I mentioned, and some people can call it basically post-production, which actually gives me the final concept painting or concept illustration. But this is one thing. The other thing of why I just utilize and I just love Octane is because I just wanted to take my 3D locations into the renderer that is artist friendly, that's easy to use, that's easy to understand, and at the same time let me do the renders that actually look like a paintings. And if I look at some of those, it looks very similar to my final paintings. So I just utilize Octane in a way that the renders themselves already look like my paintings. And from far, if you look at it, it looks pretty similar. It has a lot of atmosphere, it has a lot of depth, it has a lot of nice lighting situations, a lot of mood. So that's why I just love Octane, because it just let me do things very fast. It just let me do many different angles, and I can just play around with the mood however I want, basically. And I feel like I'm just adding options. It's like a layering down additional, pass of, post-production, additional pass of like layering paint on the canvas, basically, which is pretty, pretty organic for me as someone who hasn't started as being, someone who is very tech friendly. I just wanted to have like the software that's easy to understand, easy to pick up, and basically let me introduce that 2D painterly effect into 3D renders, which is pretty awesome. Here is some more of those tests that I did quite a while ago, but just playing around like the same setting, basically the same location, putting lighting differently, playing around with the with the mood. I just wanted to create the renders that were basically a good base to paint over, and they themselves looks like a paintings. And on the other hand, I can also, since I do work on architectural designs for almost 2 years already, and more like man-made objects, man-made prop designs, I can use Octane for more tech-friendly stuff, like this design that I've been working on for my students. And you can generate very quickly, very precise, very pristine, almost like sterile designs that, of course, on top I could just paint over to add them a little bit more, taste, a little bit more painterly taste. But it just shows that you can use Octane for both more organic stuff that sort of like looks already like a painting, and that has a lot of mood, a lot of atmosphere, that sometimes you just keep details sort of hidden. You just want to build a mysterious stuff and add like more mood to that. And at the same time, you can work on like high-tech designs that has to be presentable in a way that you can basically dive into location, and you want to show your client how the, for instance, airport terminal is being built with all the important information on the geometry, structures, design shapes, and what's not. So hopefully in this series you'll find a good introduction to an Octane, and yeah, let's have it started. All right, let's have a look into an Octane finally. So you got a pretty standard toolbar on the top. Some of the features that I would like to mention is cloud, which actually lets you render things in cloud. It's pretty awesome. As you remember, I mentioned that this particular version features RTX. It actually is one of the settings that you have to make sure it's on from the beginning. So I'm gonna make sure that RTX acceleration is on. It's gonna help you a lot when you have like a plenty of geometry and you work on the renders, the physical based options, which are path tracing or PMC. It's definitely gonna help you speed up the whole process, and you can rotate the whole scene and objects much faster when this option is turned on. Also, as you can see, I got the list of my graphic cards that I have installed in my PC. I got 3 RTX cards, and those 3 are options. They have the option where you just assign them to be responsible for rendering, and I'm just using those 3. And I have also GTX card, which is not responsible for rendering, and I'm gonna tell you why. I have 3 screens, and I'm using you know, GTX basically just to keep things being displayed on my screen. I want to make sure that the whole, you know, extra power that RTXs have over GTX, they all gonna be responsible just for rendering. So they will be basically, you know, doing all the heavy load work. And my GTX is, you know, default, I'm just gonna keep it responsible for just screen. Of course, denoising is gonna help, especially when you do when you wait for your final renders to denoise, you know, and make the best results. It's gonna, you can keep that on, but the most important for me, if I have like three much more powerful cards and one a little bit weaker, I'm just gonna make sure that those more powerful GPUs will be responsible for rendering. Also, you know, some of the important options are for geometry import, especially for OBJ and FBX that I use the most. VDB I use, of course, when I'm importing some volumetrics. But since I use mostly OBJ and FBX, I'm gonna make sure that I keep my unit in meters. So basically the same unit that I use in other 3D packages. Okay, so your main, you know, sort of field of operation is here. It's basically a node graph editor, and whatever you, when you click on the right with the right mouse, you just have all the options that are really important for you, because you can basically load geometry, you can start like placing cameras and building environment lighting and all that. But I always start with you know, render target, because you cannot do anything in here. As you see, it's a node inspector on the right side. In this toolbar you cannot do anything unless you start placing first nodes. And this is also the moment that I have to mention, this is a node-based renderer, so basically everything, every operation is made and adjusted and controlled by the nodes that are, you know, displayed somehow like on like a, you know, workboard, or, you know, like, you know, desktop sort of. Like, just gonna start with like render target, which actually includes the camera, and all those options here. If I just click on some, it starts to indicate what I'm looking at, right? So I have environment, and I indicate it on the render target node as well. So basically it's more like all those options are being zipped and like just compressed into render target. And some people assign cameras separately. You can basically you know, expand those, and you have the camera here, but I don't really need to do that, and I just keep my render targets as a separate cameras. And sometimes I just have a file when there's like plenty of render targets, because they already got camera information. Camera node is basically compressed there, so you don't need to separately expand it again when it's already in. So if we have to go to you know, all those options, let's start from the beginning. We have the scene, which actually keeps the camera, keeps environment. Then you have the render settings, which is a pretty important option, because in those, for instance, if you go to film settings, you can, you know, set up the resolutions. You can set up the, you know, all the you know, options for, you know, final resolution of your render. Let's say you can also use some presets. So I'm just gonna use standard 16:9, and of course, very important option, but especially for something that you're gonna use later along the process, is a kernel. So basically it's a you know, render engine that dictates you what sort of technology to render you use. The least heavy is of course direct lighting, so something that you start with, and the more you go into the process and the more advanced and physical based realistic results you want to get, I just recommend using path tracing. You can of course set up the quality, so all the samples, it's basically is responsible for how many render passes you can basically generate when you let the light come into the scene. So pretty important option. I guess you can keep it standard for now, because I will be using only the standard tools for now, just not to build anything that's heavy. And of course set up the render passes, but they got also their own sort of like separate node in node inspector. So if you go to here, you can set up what sort of like render pass you wanna create, you wanna just use, especially for exporting your render passes. And when you have like the beauty pass, which is of course the most important and what actually builds your final output, I of course use also object ID or material ID to separate my objects, but I'm gonna talk about it a little bit later. For now, let's focus on what we have here. We have also options for animation that I'm not gonna use right now. We have some post-production options here. It's called Imager, and you can just basically play around with all the options, and it's not gonna re-render things. It's gonna basically lay down the settings on top of your existing render, but I'm gonna show you also that later. And this is basically another just post-processing option, which actually lets you add some additional effects like shininess or like a lens flare and what's not. But just to put things into context, let me show you how you start building scenes. All right, so when we have all the options, all the settings in Octane sort of set up, I just checked my devices in the preferences. I just checked if the RTX acceleration is turned on. I can start showing you how to build a scene. So to activate this toolbar, I need to basically click on the render target. That's sort of, as I said before, it has all the information of the render passes, the environment settings, the camera settings, and lighting. And this one is basically like a gizmo and all the controls over inside of Octane. So it's pretty useful, pretty standard also. So everything that we're gonna do is gonna happen in this central part in our node graph editor. So I'm gonna start importing geometry. You can of course do that through geometry, mesh, and start adding object one by one, but I can just basically drag and drop my geometry that I prepared beforehand. I'm gonna use first very simple primitives: sphere, box, cylinder, and plane. So let's start building scene with that. You have to remember that all those separately, we have to assign to them a placement node, which sort of controls basically the position of the object, the scale of the object, whether it's being rotated or it's being basically duplicated. So I'm just assigning that to all of my objects. Then I'm just gonna add geometry group, so I can condense them all together and then attach the render target. So it's gonna basically render those objects right inside of Octane. But as you can see, we have only 2 inputs in a group, geometry group. I can of course add many more, just to have all of them together. And you can even break it down and add the group for each specific object when you have, for instance, idea of duplicating them later on, multiplying them, and what's not. But let's keep it simple from the beginning. So I have all of them assigned, and I'm gonna assign it to the render target. So as you can see, it starts to render actually the objects that I assigned through the nodes. So just to summarize, when we add objects, when we add more nodes that actually control our objects, we have to make sure it's being attached in the end of the day to the render target, because this is basically our render output that we see in the viewport, right? So this is pretty simple, I guess, at this point. Let's just maybe leave only one of my primitives, which is the cylinder. The sphere and box, just for now, it's gonna put them aside, add more placement node, and start basically, playing around with like duplicating them, maybe making them, sort of like in a different scale. So for now, whatever I duplicate, it looks basically the same, but all those placements nodes, basically they can have separate options. So I'm just gonna sort of like scale it down. It only keeps the information from my main cylinder on the material, on the color, but it doesn't really affect the scale if I'm basically changing anything separately to the placement node. So by that, in this way, you can basically generate multiple objects from basically the one object you have. And it's pretty cool, because then you can basically make a dense scene with like plenty of details with just the same object over and over again. And for instance, I can expand this this object and the material that's gonna affect all three cylinders, because it's like you are adding a placement and attaching that to the object. You basically create an instance. So it sort of like gets all the information on your material, on your colors, on formation of, like, if you have like displacement or like some additional textures, and it basically keeps the same information on all those instances. But of course, instances, they have the right to basically be changed regarding the scale, and this is basically not affecting your main form that everything is attached to, right? So it's pretty cool, I guess, and pretty obvious at this point. So I'm gonna start adding more objects, and I'm gonna make the scene more dense, and then we start applying the material definition. Okay, so what if I just want to make this plane bigger? As you saw, I'm just always sort of like activating the placement node. I can just do all my movement settings through this toolbar with the gizmos, or you can basically play around with the sliders in Node Inspector, which actually controls everything just to this numbers. So you don't need to manually do that, and it really depends on what you really want to achieve, because for more precise work, the Node Inspector and sliders can be slightly more precise than just doing things manually. But let's have a look into how you can basically control your gizmos, because now I'm just having activated the movement gizmo, so I can just move my my plane. But let's say the plane itself is correct now, and I don't want to change anything. I want to change something to my cylinder. First thing, I just want to turn off the smoothness. So all my cylinders are not being smoothed out on the edge. I already gave them enough subdivision when I was exporting them, so I don't really need additional smoothness, because it sort of like looks too smooth for me. So I just want to keep things very simple, very visible, so we can see the edges very clearly. So when I activate The gizmo movement, I still don't see anything. I just had those like XYZ gizmo activated, but I don't see it anymore because you basically have to click on placement. So the placement is responsible for every action that's gonna require, as I said, movement, scaling, and rotating. So when I have it activated, I can just move the things around. I can just basically rotate it, or I can just rotate it over this axis, or I can basically, scale it up or down. And one important thing, when you have activated the scale gizmo, you can just go through the sliders on the right side in the menu, but it's a locked, it's on lock aspect ratio. You can of course unlock it, and you can just control all axes separately, but you can also control the axis separately by just dragging external gizmos when you have it activated right on your object. But when you want to keep all those three gizmos in the same aspect ratio, you just click on the center one, and everything stays in the proportions that you have in the original object, right? It's pretty simple. Important option that I also turn on is basically 4x4 subsampling. It's gonna help you a lot when you have very heavy scenes and you have to rotate your scenes around. It sort of pixelize your viewport, but by that it doesn't need to render every frame perfectly when you are moving around your camera, because by then you basically save some time and you speed up the process, speed up the performance while I'm just basically rotating things. So if I just turn it off, it sort of try to, render things and denoising things on the go. When I'm adding subsampling 4x4, it keeps things very dirty, but at the same time, I don't need, clean results when I just move the camera, right? I just gonna move the camera and then pick up the angle that I want. So this way, I'm just saving some time and making my performance far faster. Basically, the whole process is being faster, is speeding up. So you can of course save your renders through this toolbar. This basically, I usually save just the PNG 8-bit, and you can basically also save your render passes that you have here, and you can just add, for instance, I'm just gonna add one of the most important sorry, not this one, actually material ID, I guess. Yeah, so basically one of the most important parts, especially when you have like very dense scene. For now it's of course very primitive scene, but when you have like a lot of objects, you can add material ID, and it's gonna sort of like it's just gonna mask out all objects separately. It's pretty useful, especially when you just export things to Photoshop and then start painting over. You can just very quickly select your mask through that render pass. Pretty useful stuff. You can also have like autofocus. So basically this option lets you rotate things around the object that you just click on, and it's sort of like pick up the focus on in this area. Specifically works when you have also aperture option turned on in the camera, but I just turn it off for now because I don't really need to play around with focus. I just have like very simple objects. I didn't even add any lighting information yet. So for now we just start building scene. So yeah, let's try to add some more primitives. Let's try to play around with more options to achieve more dense scene, and then I would like to go into adding material definitions and playing around with the lighting. So let's try to use my other primitive. It can be a box, just to generate some more traffic in this scene, I guess. you can let's make it like something like that, when you have more than one object that's sort of like embracing all those cylinders. It might be some platform, whatever. I'm just gonna show you first what's going on, but I think it's a good idea to just maybe get rid of that flat lighting right now and add the daylight system, because by that you are able to see more of the forms that I'm working on. So as you can see, you can just drag and drop, play around with the lighting according to the world map. More precise option can be of course achieved with the sliders, and it's a pretty accurate lighting system that sort of like lets you see things according to the world guide time and time zones, basically, right? So pretty cool. By that I can also like see more shapes, so maybe I can just add my sphere right now, the composition. I'm just gonna assign my sphere right now. I can just move it to the composition. Maybe the sphere could be like really huge and sort of like add some nice variation to the shapes. I don't know, I'm just trying things on the go right now, but I think the lighting helps to read forms much better, right, and understand actually what we are doing in a much better way. Can also the plane a little bit bigger. Maybe the plane could actually have some color variation as well. I don't know, just to show you that you can assign things separately to all objects, right? Sometimes it just doesn't read the smoothness, I guess, so we can basically reload. Yeah, and it works. Reload the render. It happens, so don't worry. So yeah, I can maybe just duplicate my sphere one more time. Maybe just this time, I'm just gonna create like a super small one. Oops. Bigger, maybe just I don't want to go over the canvas here. Again, just gonna reload the scene, and then yeah, you have some sort of like a situation, and then you can just start placing things out. Like I can imagine that this might be some sort of like industrial structure, or complex, or yeah, this sort of like infrastructure, and you can just start playing around with details. But I have prepared some some assets, so I will show you next how to play around with the lighting. But now I would like to move on very quickly to material definition, just to show you how we can basically make various materials in no time. So let's have a look. All right, let's start with basically applying first materials to my object. I'm gonna use a sphere because of course it's the best object in terms of parameters to really start assigning some material definition. As you can see, the base material is a diffuse, and we in CGI can call this material albedo, or basically base material. Albedo you can met when you, for instance, use ready or scanned assets like megascans, and you have albedo, which basically you just stamp on the object, and it gives you all important color information of your object, right? So with the diffuse, you can change the color, right? You can just add whatever you want, and basically keep in mind that every object in real life basically has its own diffuse, has some sort of like local color, even when it's like super reflective or, you know, metallic. It has a diffuse and it has a local color. That's how we also learn how to shade objects when we paint. We start with a local color, then we add like a darker value, and then we also you know, expand the range of values basically by bringing also highlights and more midtones, right? So this is an important note, and I just basically use diffuse if I want to have like very clean block out, or, you know, like just very simple, you know, value. I don't want to have like any specular, I don't want to have any reflections, so I can just leave it as it is, and don't really need to play around with like any other options here. You can play around with roughness, but it doesn't really change that much. As it changes, for instance, when you turn on glossiness. If you turn on glossy material, you can clearly see that right now my object, my sphere, starts to reflecting environment, right? And you can even emphasize this effect even more by playing around with the roughness, as I mentioned. So for instance, the more rough material it is, the more matte, the more sort of like it scatters lighting across the object because of the rough material, you know, and its nature. So you can just almost like, you know, make it like totally, you know, as low in numbers as you can, and then you got like clear representation of your reflection, and I can clearly see, you know, what's standing next to my sphere. Let me just put up this sphere a little bit higher. So you can right now see how well it reflects environment, right? Or how well it reflects the objects that are next to the sphere. And of course you can still apply some diffuse, right? So as I mentioned, this object still can have some local color, even though it's fully reflective. Right now I applied some color to that. It looks pretty cool. And then the other option that I play around with a lot is in the index of refraction. So basically, index of refraction, you know, from the definition, it just basically determines like how strong the reflection on your object will be, and it's basically is according to the Fresnel effect. And Fresnel effect you can for instance observe when you look at the water. When you stand on the shore and you face down on the water surface, you see that the water is of course transparent, and you can see the ground, you can see the plants you know, underneath, and you see of course your reflection, but the reflection will be stronger if you put your head up and you see you look into the water surface farther. So it can be even like on the other side of the shore, you can see that reflected image on the water surface much stronger, and the water also has more volume. So this is the Fresnel effect, and this is very close to, you know, it's actually how index of refraction is being dictated. So the more you go with index of refraction, the more you can see like a strong reflection from the base definition, right? So every object also in nature has its own index of refraction, which is important to remember. So if you want to have like very realistic representation, you can look up online into each object and basically apply those numbers when you work on your renders, and you want to have like the best possible and realistic results, right? Also we can play around with opacity, but I don't really like using that for glossy materials. I rather just use specular material that I will also briefly introduce. And then we of course have bumps and normal maps and displacements that I will also show on other examples. I guess the glossy actually material is actually one of them. It's actually, yeah, it actually is the most used material by me because it lets you do stuff that's more rough and it's like more metallic. You can do more reflective materials. You can do basically whatever material you want, briefly with the glossy preset. So I think this is the most useful. And yeah, let's have a look into the other ones. So what if I just take my cylinder and I apply specular material, which is another, you can have also metallic, which is basically the preset made for metal materials. It's pretty cool, I have to say, but at the same time you can also achieve pretty good results for metal or like reflective materials through the glossy material, as I introduced it just briefly previously. So yeah, it has like pretty cool options also for IOR, so index of refraction. You can play around with like also the opacity, which I don't really use specifically for this one. And yeah, it has a good representations of metal. It's good, I like it, but I still can stick to the glossy material. And maybe let's apply to this one also specular. Maybe I can just I can basically create, I actually need to create a new one. So I'm just gonna move it, just turn off this one, and this one will be specular. Specular, you can see it's a good material. It definitely represents materials like glass or water. And of course, the roughness is the first one that sort of like dictates you how well you can look through this material, like how you see the transmission within this material, and you can see the object on the other side when it's actually covered by our specular material. It's pretty cool. Same with refraction. It just changes the angle that we see the refracted image inside of the the object that we assign material to. So you can have also you can also like change some colors to the reflection and how we really see the it's sort of like when you have colorized glass and you can see, for instance, a bowl of beer or whatever. It's basically having this sort of like properties with the transmission and reflection, and pretty cool, like very easy to achieve realistic realistic materials and realistic results. So this is another one that I could use. Yeah, pretty easy to achieve some nice results for like glossy structure. And I really like the way that our glossy sphere is reflecting, is you know, having reflected that bottle, the cylinder that is right next to it. So it's pretty much good representation in terms of physics, but you can even increase that by applying a kernel that's path tracing, because now, as you can see, there are more lighting particles, and it starts like calculating lighting much more in much more detailed way, much more accurately, as it's happening in the physics. So for the best results, of course, I would go for path tracing, as I mentioned way before. So we can use it for now, but we don't really need, because it's gonna slow down the renders a lot. And let me just try to maybe apply one more material to the box. Of course, the third material I would like to use is a mixed material, but first maybe I can also add some cool reflectiveness to our base box material. So it's this one. So we can maybe make it glossy, maybe we can make it like darker, and it nicely reflects you know, objects that are, you know, standing on it. But let's try to add path tracing just to have the best, you know, physical results, and it starts to look like really realistic right now. I can even add one more thing. I'm just gonna save the file. I can even add one more thing. Maybe you can play around with like an environment itself and add some interesting sky that would fit to our lighting condition. I don't know, maybe something like that. So basically, you can play around with UVs to just, you know, adjust your texture, and you can see it also nicely represent. I'm just gonna add maybe not full, but almost like a full mirror-like reflectiveness to our box, so we can clearly see when I rotate my sky, it reflects back also the environment, which is pretty awesome. You know, it starts like adding this sort of like super real effect, right? Add some interesting color to that as well, just to have some nice vibe, you know. So even like reducing the roughness even more. Yeah, so it's almost like a mirror. Yeah. So the last one, the box one, will actually I want to make it into the mixed material, and the first material I would like to also take from some of them that I already use. So I'm gonna use my my sphere material, which is a glossy material, and the second one will be, I don't know, basically maybe just create just a normal diffuse material. So in a mixed material, you basically estimate the proportion between one and other material. So for now it's half. It's half glossy, half diffuse. You can make it either fully diffuse or fully glossy, or meet them in between, right? And just play around with all different options, because all those materials right now, those two materials actually are rooted to my mix material. So if you just all put all collapse together, you can see it's basically the amount that is estimating what material is the more prominent, and on top of that you can also throw some displacement. So this is pretty much all the settings that I use for materials at this point. These are the standard ones, but at the same time the most useful, and you can basically create whatever you want with those materials that I presented. Of course, I encourage you guys to play around with all the options, specifically look into the transmission in specular material in a way that you can also play around with where's this material, with the dispersion effect as well. Of course, don't forget about index of refraction. This brings a lot of interest, refractions in the material. In the glossy material, I would like you to play around with also a lot of different settings for the roughness, because this actually lets you create things that are pretty realistic in a very limited amount of time. So yeah, I think for the intro part of material, I would also maybe mention the bump and displacement. So stay up, and I'm just gonna quickly introduce you to those options. All right, just to wrap up this chapter and summarize everything I've been guiding you through, I would like to just take this Megascan asset and bring all the materials, nodes, and material definition to this form based on prepared preset by Megascan guys. So basically, of course, I have to take albedo first, which is basically our diffuse material, diffuse color of the whole material. I'm just gonna assign it to the diffuse. You can see it's nicely, projecting texture, because it's fully baked and UV already. So now of course I'm gonna take displacement and roughness as well. So roughness gonna land in its own node, and displacement, actually I have to add displacement texture first to my diffuse material, and then add the displacement map to this displacement texture displacement node. And you can of course make it better, because I use 8K Megascans, so I need to make sure this is the best possible results, and I can already see there is some crispiness, but I also need to add normal map. But on top of that, I don't have like any shininess, any speculars. It's because basically we don't have the material is still in diffuse mode, so I have to transform it transform that into glossy material. Now I can start like see this gets like pretty impressive realistic results, right? I want to also make sure that my sky is better projected. Oh. And at the same time, I can also apply the texture that I got for the ground. So the same thing, albedo for the plane. Gonna expand that on. Already gonna make it into glossy. Of course, it cannot be super glossy, so I have to make sure the roughness and specular is on the low level. But actually this texture itself has interesting displacement, so I'm gonna add displacement node as well. Geometry, displacement texture, and again displacement has to be set on 8K just for best results. And we can start like generating, you know, height map, right? So this sort of like looks cool. And I still need to add, of course, normal map. It just takes some time to load things. Now I can see it start to shine through. And roughness as well. I'm just like sort of like placing them down as you see separately, but I just do that before I want, like, because I wanna make sure that that I can still control them later on anyway. So I can adjust also the value of the ground. It sort of have like a different right now color, but it's not a big deal. I can even take my main rock structure and do exactly what we did with the boxes and what's not, you know. So basically play around with it, you know, maybe change even some of the scale. Just to have like some really interesting, you know, vibe. And Yeah, it looks pretty realistic already, so we got some cool results. I can also adjust the lighting a little bit more. And then just paint over some stuff, you know, so it's get like a really interesting information and composition, and maybe I can even like make this part slightly, you know, more bumped up. So now I'm just actually already, you know, starting to like playing around with the composition, imagining that, you know, I could just paint over this, you know. It's pretty cool. So yeah, I'm just being silent a little bit because I just have fun with that, and you know, start to really diving into this concept, into this setting. So I can also show you some quick post-production elements, like just unifying all the colors by just adding some cool filters on top. And yeah, just playing around, maybe just adding, I don't like, maybe just, yeah, maybe more real, maybe just adding some vignette effect, you know, it's sort of like brings the, it has a good vibe already. Now let's just drag some sun and see. Yeah, I imagine that this could be a, you know, sun is there, and you can actually make the sun bigger. And now we can just add some post-production. So just a slightly more dynamic camera. So sort of like reminds me my photo trip to Taiwan back in 2016 and 17, I guess, when I was doing a workshop there and had like a chance to also go for like hiking, and yeah, it was an incredible trip. Good old days. Come on. Yeah, slightly moved it. Gonna save the file as well, just to make sure nothing's get lost. What else? I'm just, yeah. And now you can just copy my I can just copy my camera angle, and yeah, just play around with like multiple different shots, right? So having the same mood, look how many amazing shots I can basically generate to paint over. It's wicked, you know. It's like opportunities are endless. So yeah, hope you guys found that introduction to Octane useful, and see you in the next video. So bye bye, have fun, and see you soon.